So in this first video of these service design-based approaches to help you begin planning for and conducting the neighbourhood analysis that we have to complete as part of Work Package 4 in I2I project, we're going to talk a little bit about stakeholder mapping. Now, stakeholder mapping is probably well known to most of you. It's a sort of activity that crops up in various different facets. I know Walter has talked about stakeholder mapping on this project to support the communication process. And really, this video is also intended to serve as something of an introduction to stakeholder mapping, as it may also be applied to your Work Package 5 deliverables around communication events. So events that you have to host in the course of this project to help disseminate the learning from the project, or if we want to take a more participatory and co-design approach, events that you will host in the course of the project to help co-design or co-create deliverables with members of the local community. But in terms of what we will cover in this video, we're basically going to cover three ways of structuring stakeholder mapping to help us situate the rather abstract and rather complex topic of social isolation, social exclusion, and loneliness within our local communities. And we're going to do this by taking what we refer to as an inside-out approach to stakeholder mapping, an outside-in approach to stakeholder mapping, and an issue-based approach to stakeholder mapping. And this will then give you a range of different ways of approaching stakeholder mapping to help you both in this project, but also in general in your work, take multiple different routes to thinking about identifying the stakeholders in any particular project you're working on. And this flexibility to take inside out, outside in, activity-based approaches hopefully then just gives a flavor of how it becomes easier to think about the users in the situations that we're focusing in. So it can often be a little hard to know where to start tackling a relatively complex social policy issue such as social isolation or loneliness. And as a result, in beginning to think about who the stakeholders are in this process, and as a prerequisite to beginning to then identify who are the people that in this situation we want to go out and interview or observe or conduct our neighborhood analysis with, there are really two main approaches that can be helpful for framing that problem and helping us to think about who those people are. The first and probably most accessible way to begin identifying then relevant stakeholders to work with on this project, or beginning to identify neighborhoods that we can go and analyze, are to really begin to think about what existing activities or events your organization might already conduct, already have in the work plan. And then from that, you can identify the likely users or the existing users you have contact with. And again, from that still begin to identify how you might engage some of those existing contacts in this activity. Now, this approach is particularly conducive if you work in quite a service delivery focused organization already, or you have strong contacts, as I think it sounds like many of you do, related to how you're planning to structure the I2I work. If you have particularly strong contacts with local or voluntary sector organizations, or you work quite close to service delivery, this approach to stakeholder mapping is probably most useful for you. Later in this presentation, I will talk about a different approach if you work at a more strategic level, how you can start from the outside in and work your way down to a more concrete user level. But to start with this inside out is often the most accessible way for people to begin thinking about how they can involve their existing users in the service development process. Now, it's worth just saying a quick word about facilitation here. In other words, just a quick overview of some ideas about how you can conduct this stakeholder mapping activity yourselves as individuals and within your organization. Stakeholder mapping, as I'm sure most of you have already experienced, is an ideal activity to be done in groups. The sort of idea that many heads are better than one. But it is also an activity that can be done individually, and there are certainly pros and cons to both approaches. Maybe you want to think within your project group on eye to eye about a combination of those two things. It's certainly likely that some of the activities that we have in these videos and that we're putting up as potentially helpful in this project, that there's certainly value to going away and doing them as individuals more than there is about discussing them in a group activity. And then equally, there are other activities that are more conducive to group-based discussion. But it's entirely up to you how you want to conduct this. What we'll do is we'll discuss as we go along various points around facilitation, what to look out for, what to think about if you are conducting that in a group. But in general, it's perfectly possible to conduct all these activities individually at your desk, and then also together with other people. So this approach, taking an inside-out approach to stakeholder mapping, really starts with thinking a little bit about yourself. We obviously think about co-design as an activity done with others, and that's very important. But the process of identifying who those other people are and how you're going to begin working with them, identify them, and then begin working with them, really starts from a process of self-reflection about where you are yourself as an individual, who you know, who you have access to, what some of your own assumptions are about who those people are, and how you're going to make contact with them. And then thinking more broadly, how you position yourself as a professional, as an individual conducting this activity in relation to those other people. And we'll talk in more detail about this in the sections devoted to interviews and observation, where you have direct contact with those other people, and how service design can help you conduct those activities. So to get started on this inside-out approach to stakeholder mapping, really the task here is to start thinking on a personal level. What are your perceptions of people who are socially isolated or lonely? Do you know some of those people? Have you had professional contact with some of those people? What are the media representations of those people? What is it that researchers that you've maybe read or researchers that you know have said about those people? And how have these things come together to form your perception of what it means to be socially isolated or lonely? And while we're beginning to think about those things, I can introduce this visual device that will crop up a number of times in a number of different ways in this stakeholder mapping work. We obviously talk a lot in service design and in terms of taking a design-oriented approach about putting users at the center. And this is just a visual tool that can help us do that. And potentially, as you're starting to think about putting yourself at the center, as we start from the inside and work our way out in mapping our stakeholders, this could be a helpful way to visualize your own thinking, your own notes, your own observations in terms of other people you know, or other people who've been influential in shaping your own perception of what it means to be socially isolated or lonely. So feel free to use this. There's this diagram is available to download. So feel free to use this if it's helpful, or change the categories if you can think of ones that are better. But this is also just a chance, as well as sort of forming these thoughts in our heads, as we start to take a more service design oriented approach, we also have to start thinking about how we visualize that and how we can share that. This could also be an activity that's done individually, or it could be something that you do as a group where you brainstorm together your individual ideas and you use a visual diagram like this to map those up with post-it notes or so on and so forth. So this is just a little visual guide to help you structure your thinking around this activity. This next activity is very much the same in principle, but is instead thinking more organizationally. What are the relationships your organization has with other organizations who work in this area? Now, it is up to you which of these categories you use. This stakeholder bullseye is a very common technique for helping visualize around a particular focal point the different actors or different types of stakeholder group that work in a particular place. We have provided those templates. There'll be a link alongside the link to this video where you can access blank versions of those templates yourself. But you may also wish to change the categories if these categories don't quite fit. These are roughly taken, as I've explained already, from the quadruple helix stakeholders at a high level, as well as obviously thinking about groups such as the media who don't quite come under quadruple helix, or activist groups, which is a sort of grey area because some voluntary sector organisations engage in advocacy work as well as provide services. But assuming these categories are applicable to your context, as I say, you're very welcome to download one of the blank bullseye templates and come up with 8 or 6, however many is appropriate categories that are more suitable for yourselves. Now is probably a good time, and potentially, as I say, conducted as a group activity, to begin to think about, at an organizational level, who are the other organizations that your organization has contact with around this issue. So if you've been following along with the different activities that I've been introducing, the individual reflections, the organizational level reflections, you're hopefully now at a point where, with the benefit of those exercises, you've sort of downloaded all the assumptions or different ideas that you as an individual and potentially also members of your team have around who the people are who may be at risk of social isolation and loneliness, and how your organization perhaps interacts with some of those people or already has contact with some of those people. And you've maybe also had a chance to discuss, as far as was comfortable, personal interest or personal involvement you have around this topic, and whether indeed that has opened up avenues for further exploration, people you can make contact with more easily, and so on and so forth. And this idea of thinking things through from an individual to an organizational level, I think supports us to then go one step further now and to begin to think about where our organization sits within the public sector landscape, or within the social policy environment, or within the social environment in which it operates, where your organization is in the service delivery process. And we can, of course, talk more about this in the webinar on the 13th of May that builds on these introductory videos. But I'm hopeful that this diagram, which I shared in my initial presentation at the project launch, should be intuitive enough when we talk about the quadruple helix approach and we talk about the quadruple helix actors that we're involving in this eye-to-eye project, that it should be easy enough as we start to think about mapping stakeholders and identifying service users, that we can ourselves identify where our organizations sit in this service delivery landscape. So by this stage in the process, we've done an individual reflection on who are the people that come to mind, or who are the people that we know as individuals who work in this space, who either are at risk of social isolation themselves or do work in this area. And then we followed that by a reflection on organizationally, as an organization, what is our collective knowledge about other organizations who work in this space? So we've done two levels of analysis, an individual level analysis, an organization level analysis. There's another technique or another way of focusing stakeholder mapping that can potentially be valuable and can potentially be a little bit easier, certainly more pragmatic than those other two activities, which is to think about existing events or community-based activities that you're already aware of. Perhaps they're events that have been run by or are being run by some of the organizations or individuals you've identified previously. So perhaps if you don't know of any existing events, now would be a good time to build on the earlier activities you've just done and go away and see if any of those organizations or any of those individuals are already hosting an event. Now, this, as a general principle, applies to sort of building your network, building your stakeholder network, and potentially is of relevance even more in the corona time that we're living in, where there aren't so many face-to-face meetings or a lot of activities have been cancelled, but maybe people are switching to digital meetings, or there's a chance to gather people together around this particular topic and share resources amongst organizations to host one meeting where a number of different local organizations can discuss the issue. In any case, the next exercise is really just thinking around particular events or activities, maybe that your organization already has planned or that your organization delivers regularly. And this could be as general as, like, for an organization like ourselves in Värmland, who operate the hospitals, this could actually be thinking about existing events that happen in the hospital where we are likely to meet certain types of actors. So it could literally be an analysis at a desk-based level, like we're working just now, of thinking through who are the people that are coming into the accident and emergency department, and which of these stakeholder categories do they fall into. Or it could be something more communication focused, whereby we know that people are hosting informational events or consultation events locally, some community group that meets every Thursday night. We can simply conduct a brainstorm around that particular event or activity and think about who are the people who attend and how they might have information or know other people or be of interest to us as we plan this part of the eye-to-eye work that we're organizing. So far we've covered three approaches: an individual level approach, an organizational level approach, and an activity-focused approach to take what we're referring to as the inside-out approach to mapping our stakeholders. And if you've been following along or doing those activities in line with the order that we've been presenting them in the video, you should by now have a range of different brainstorm-driven ideas and summaries of who the different groups are that you think exist, and who the different individuals are, what stakeholders, in other words, exist in your local area that may be of relevance to the eye-to-eye work that we're doing. If that potentially has been difficult to do because you're maybe an individual or an organization that works at a more strategic level, more holistic level, I know a lot of academics have very good relationships with the local community, but it might also be the case, and I've certainly done a lot of work in the past helping people who work at the potentially far away from practice, but have research or do work that is of relevance to practice, that it may be more difficult for you to identify people who are working with service users or to have contact as it is at present with people who work at that front line level. And this is obviously going to be a challenge with respect to the neighbourhood analysis that we have to conduct, because really something like the neighbourhood analysis is very much about conducting consultation activity with people at a very personal level. So we have to be able to identify who those people are and make some degree of contact with them. But it may also be, therefore, easier for some of you to start at the outside in, to think about at a more national or at a more theoretical or strategic level, who are the types of people that you might want to gain access to or identify in your local area based on a more theoretical or strategic model of the issue of loneliness or social isolation or social exclusion. And this is what we're referring to as outside in. On practical level, it's probably no different. I think we've all shared enough information and we all have a lot of existing knowledge and competence around this topic already. So chances are any brainstorm activity around the topic of social isolation and loneliness has touched on this more strategic national policy level type actor, the politicians in our national capital who are involved in developing policy or lead the health department there, right down to local politicians, as well as maybe people in our own organizations who work at a more strategic level. So chances are there's a degree of overlap here if you have been following along with the other activities. But it might also be, as I say, for some of you that this is a better place to start to then begin to open up ideas or thought processes amongst yourselves around who at a local level is best to approach. So like I say, practically, chances are you'll end up with a very similar diagram or similar level of analysis. If you start with this outside-in approach, or if it's just easier for you, given your current understanding of the issue, to think at a more holistic level. But probably the group that will be missing, I think, if you start at this level, is the service users. But that's okay, because those are the groups that we'll obviously be meeting when we go out and do a neighbourhood analysis, or at least people who work a lot closer to them and can tell us a lot more about them. This is sort of a point worth reflecting on, I think, at this stage, because obviously the service design techniques that we're going to tell you more about in these videos, and that we're hoping many of you will be able to undertake yourselves as you do this work on the Eye to Eye project, are really also about learning more about the issue. So it is absolutely fine if at this stage you do have gaps in your analysis. Maybe some of these areas are not applicable to your context. We've tried to pick relatively high level and generalizable descriptions for the different types of stakeholder that you might encounter, but some of these might just be gaps in your current knowledge or current analysis, or they may just not exist in your local context. That's absolutely fine, but it's also beginning to think about, if those gaps exist, who is it that you already know, or some of those people that you've already identified, that you could ask some questions of to help understand, do they know who these people are, or do they have contact with people who might fall into this group? Maybe you don't have any real political contacts yourself right now. So maybe it's about, when you do go out and do your interviews and the neighbourhood analysis, beginning to have discussions with frontline workers and anyone else you might have contact with about, well, who is the politician who has overall responsibility for this area? Or who is the local councillor or local politician who is most engaged with this issue? And using this stakeholder mapping process to think about the gaps in your knowledge, as well as documenting what it is that, between all the project members in your organization working on this project, the people that you already know. So the final approach or way of structuring stakeholder identification that we're going to discuss here is a more speculative or more creative approach. And again, one that's probably a little overlapping with some of the previous approaches discussed in this video, but is what we're calling issue-based stakeholder identification. And again, we've been sharing a lot of different models. The project itself in the application focused in on different definitions and different models. But in general terms, this approach is about identifying particular theoretical models or particular conceptual models of the issues at hand, so social isolation or loneliness, that help expand the concept slightly or broaden our existing understanding of what that means and what that looks like, and then by implication, who the people might be that are at risk of these phenomena. So, doubtless, given the way you've been thinking about your own work to date, you have your own, perhaps favourite models that you've already begun to use as a project group, or that because they were specified in the application, you've begun to structure a lot of your thinking around. That's absolutely fine. The purpose of this exercise is really just to help document some of that, perhaps up until now, implicit thought process. And as we're thinking about moving towards more explicitly co-design led activities and thinking about, well, how would we begin to have conversations with people in the community who maybe haven't thought about these topics in such academic terms or in such comprehensive terms, what are the most accessible models we can use and how can we visualize that understanding? Indeed, this sort of issue-based approach could form the basis of a very nice introductory activity in a workshop or in a co-creation session or even as part of your neighborhood analysis. We'll come on and talk in the later sections about this model in particular, the Dahlberg and McKee model, because that was the actual starting point of one of our initial workshop-based activities where we began to discuss the topic of loneliness and social exclusion with people in our community using this model and these particular headings. But like I say, you're welcome to choose whatever you wish, to use that one if it makes sense to you, or to define your own. There's no real recommendation from our point of view around what's best in these terms. It depends a little bit on what you're hoping to achieve. This model, I think, came from some of the project documentation that Paula gathered. Is a lot more comprehensive and perhaps a lot more concrete, a lot more of a sort of individual level analysis. And I think the general recommendation would be that if you're talking about going out and doing work with people in the street, so to speak, people who don't have an academic level understanding of this topic or working in this way, to certainly try and identify models that are accessible and that sort of explain the concept in concrete terms. There'll obviously be a balance to be struck because the more concrete a model maybe explains, as in this case, the individuals who are at risk of social isolation, the more potentially ethical issues there are around the stereotypes or the norms or the assumptions that you're using to discuss this topic. So certainly there's a degree of safety in a model that's more abstract, harder for people to understand maybe, but less likely to perhaps infer that you're singling out individual groups and potentially a bit safer for beginning a conversation about this. You'll very much have to judge in your own context and in terms of the level of trust you have with the people that you're working with around this as to what model is most appropriate and how best to approach that. We will discuss some of those points again in the planning for the interview. But the purpose here, in any case, is to begin to think more expansively by using these theoretical models or different conceptual models of what social isolation and loneliness is, to broaden a discussion or broaden reflection on who you think the people are who are at risk of this. And again, much like we have in the previous activities, to think about how we identify those people, where those people are, what neighborhood we might find some of those people, and to think about some of the other associated individuals who we might be able to make contact with to help us begin that neighborhood analysis process. So to come back down to the more practical issue at hand around planning the stakeholder identification in an issue-based way for the eye-to-eye neighborhood analysis, really the first task perhaps is looking again at the academic models, the theoretical models, the conceptual models we've already shared or that you yourself have gathered so far in the project, and identifying a subset of those issues that are perhaps of most relevance to your planned work. Or if your intent at this stage of keeping it as broad as possible, you're not sort of predefining which issues within the context of social isolation and loneliness or within your neighborhood you actually know you're going to work on. If you do just want to keep it quite general and go out and use this neighborhood analysis as a chance to identify those issues in the first place, you just need to identify a model that's generalizable enough that you will be able, with some confidence, to begin to listen to what people are telling you when you go out and do that work, but then be able to summarize that and visualize that around particular issues that perhaps these models from the research can help you identify. But if you are interested in taking a more individual issue-based approach, you can, for example, taking from that previous model that I shared, identify subset issues or subset user groups who are perhaps at more risk of social isolation, according to the research. And you could choose to single out these groups or a range of these groups as the basis on which you can identify which neighborhoods or which target groups you want to go and conduct the neighborhood analysis and interviews or observation with. So in terms of how that would work in practice, this could be an individual exercise or a group-based activity where, for example, the previous model that I mentioned identifies the fact that people who've recently been bereaved are at a heightened risk of social isolation or loneliness. So this could then be a brainstorming activity that you conduct amongst your research group or the group who will be going out and doing the neighborhood analysis, researching that local context, and conducting those interviews, to think about, well, where would we meet bereaved people? And who are bereaved people? And what existing groups or organizations within our community have contact with those people? And how can we make contact with those organizations to then perhaps set up some sort of discussion, or in Corona time, some sort of webinar where we maybe introduce the work that we're doing on the Eye-to-Eye project and then begin to conduct the observation or the interview that we need to do. So not a particularly elaborately worked example here, but hopefully enough, whether you take each individual risk factor or each individual facet of whatever theoretical model it is that you're using, and spend 5, 10, 15 minutes as an individual or a group just brainstorming around who are the people that are at risk of being bereaved or are at risk of loneliness, and what other people do we know in our local community who can help us make contact with those individuals. So that concludes our first video, which introduced a range of different ways that you can begin to think about the different users and the different people in this problem space, this project investigating social isolation and loneliness. As we begin to think about planning our neighborhood analysis, we begin to think about making that project more concrete, and we begin to take a user-centered approach to doing so. Hopefully, you found the range of different activities to begin to think about stakeholders, the people, helpful as part of your planning, or certainly helpful to help document maybe some of the thoughts and ideas that you either had individually or as a team around this topic. We will cover in the next video how you can start to analyze that data a little more. You've gathered all of those ideas and those insights about who those people might be. And we'll just run through a similar range of different tools that might be helpful to you to start to think about how you might communicate with those people, and then thereafter to begin to identify which method or which approach is best for making contact with those people or understanding more about their lives and therefore also about this issue.